Hello everyone, this is Marshall Gittler, Head of Investment Research here at FXPRIMUS, bringing you the day's schedule of events for Tuesday, April 12th. The day started with data from Australia. The National Australian Bank NAB Business Conditions Index rose to 12 from 8. Like the Westpac Melbourne Institute Consumer Confidence Index, which will be released overnight, there was no forecast. The two indices have been oscillating around the boom or bust line for some time now, showing no particular trend. Now, sentiment in April, the month for the Westpac Index, may be negatively affected by Australian politics after the Prime Minister indicated that an early double dissolution election is now likely in July. Europe starts off with UK CPI for March. This is important as it comes 2 days before the Bank of England meeting. Not that anyone expects the Bank of England to change its stance. The year-on-year rate of inflation is expected to accelerate in March, both the headline number and the core inflation. This could give a somewhat more optimistic tone to the Bank of England minutes and might therefore be taken as positive for sterling. The U.S. data starts off with the National Federation of Independent Businesses, the NFIB Small Business Optimism Survey. The survey is expected to improve, which should be good news for the dollar. Small businesses employ the bulk of people in the U.S., and so rising conditions there suggest improving labor conditions, which is very important for the Fed. One odd risk to be aware of today: the EU Commission will weigh requiring U.S. and Canadian citizens to get visas for travel to the EU, because the two countries both require entry visas from citizens of some EU countries. Now, admittedly, any decision by the Commission won't be final. Nonetheless, it could raise tensions a bit, a little over a week before President Obama arrives in Europe for a visit that includes trade talks. My guess is that this would hurt the U.S. and therefore the dollar more than the EU, since the EU accounts for 17% of U.S. exports, but the U.S. accounts for only 7% of EU exports. Speaking of imports and exports, the U.S. Import Price Index is expected to rise, which should be good news for inflation and therefore good news for the dollar. Sometime during the U.S. day, the IMF World Bank spring meetings will commence. They run until Sunday. There are seminars, briefings, press conferences, and many other events concerning the global economy and financial markets. Look for lots of market-moving comments by a wide range of officials from all over. Finally, overnight we get China's trade data. The trade surplus is expected to rise, with exports performing well and imports still declining year on year. The export figure, though, is a bit deceptive, as exports were down sharply in March last year. The figure could be negative for the Australian dollar. This is Marshall Gittler, Head of Investment Research at FXPRIMUS. Get more market insights on our education pages and turn your trading ideas into action with FXPRIMUS, the safest place to trade.